The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
So I just want to say a couple of things before we sort of formally start. The first is to say there are just 2 more talks in the series this semester. Next Monday, this time, this place, and the Monday after that. But we'll be back next fall as well. And then particularly for this evening, I just want to say that our speaker for tonight has been very gracious in bringing in some material, some data that he's working on now and that has not been published, and he'll be presenting it to us. And I ask that if you're taking notes for the class or whatever, that you not do photos, screenshots, that people don't try to do recordings or other captures of the information out of politeness for the intellectual property. So I will stop there, and I'm going to actually let our own Andy Murtha, one of our many distinguished China scholars here, do the introduction tonight, because he and the speaker do go back some ways, and it seems appropriate. So Andy, would you take over for me, please?
Yes, happy to, Robin.
Thanks.
So can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm not all mic'd up. Okay, so I have to read this because there's so much that I could say. I have to kind of narrow it down just to kind of a bite-sized portion here. So Dr. Andrew Erickson is a professor of strategy in the U.S. Naval War College, in the NWC's China Maritime Studies Institute. As a core founding member, he helped establish CMSI and to stand it up officially in 2006. He has subsequently played an integral role in the development of the Institute. It has inspired the creation of other research centers to which he has provided advice and support. And since 2008, Andrew has been an associate in research at Harvard University's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, and he is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Andrew received his PhD and MA in politics from Princeton University. And he graduated magna cum laude from Amherst College. In addition to many other things, he edits the Naval War College Review. The current spring 2018 issue has 2 articles on China underway: Beijing's strategy to build China into a maritime great power, and a maritime oil blockade against China. Andrew did not write these, but in order for these to be published, he had to approve them, so they all have his imprimatur on them. He is also the author of the book Chinese Anti-Ship Ballistic Missile Development, which is published by the Jamestown Foundation and available from Brookings Institution Press. Andrew also asked me to let you all know to be sure to visit andrewerickson.com. Not because he wants to make a buck off of the gift shop there, but rather because there's an awful lot of information there that I think might be useful to many of you, which he has graciously put online, that reflects years and years of really first-rate research and policy analysis. The last thing I would say is that Andrew is a good friend, somebody with whom I have been talking China stuff for about 10 years now. And it is really my pleasure, my genuine pleasure, to introduce, without any further ado, Andrew Erickson. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, for that kind introduction. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you all here at Cornell. I've dreamed of visiting this campus for a long time, and it's finally come true, so I'm very happy about that. I know you have some very dynamic China and East Asia programming here. I'm grateful for all the support and the coordination of this great event. What I want to offer you today are some thoughts based on specialized research in an area that not everyone has a chance to study, but which ultimately I think has an impact on all of our lives and the world that we live in. And that's the subject of China's maritime development. China already is one of the world's great sea powers, great maritime powers, major states involved in activities at sea, and it's poised to become even more so in coming years. Now, China's activities at sea are very broad. There's a huge economic dimension. I'm going to look more at the security dimension. That's what I study in depth, but there could be many different presentations on this subject. Now, before I go further, let me add to the caveats and disclaimers and just explain what I think most of you already know. These are just my personal views based on open source Chinese language research. They don't represent the policies or estimates of the US Navy or any other organization of the US government. So I'm sharing these thoughts from my research to highlight what I think are some key dynamics for us to look at and to catalyze some discussion in the Q&A in the latter half of this session. Now, I could tell you a lot more about my home institution and our institute. Suffice it to say, the Naval War College, for those who are not familiar, is the senior school of the U.S. Navy. It's one of roughly 13 academic institutions within the organizational structure of the U.S. military. And within our college in Newport, Rhode Island, since 2006, we've had the China Maritime Studies Institute, which I helped to set up. We focus on performing academic Chinese language research to better understand China's efforts and activities at sea, to explain this to the U.S. government, especially the U.S. Navy, to engage with Chinese counterparts, including the Chinese Navy. I'm very proud that in 2014, I helped to stand up an exchange program, a student exchange program with our counterpart institution, the Nanjing Command and Staff College, which is the closest Chinese equivalent to the U.S. Naval War College. And finally, we also seek to engage and inform the public and public discussion of China's maritime activities. So that mission is connected with us all getting together today here. Now, there are many experts in the room, including the China-related, the China-focused faculty who have joined us here. So I know there is a lot of in-depth research that can be done. Please, as we said, no photographs, please. Thank you. On Chinese foreign policy. Let me just distill what I think are some of the key points as relevant to China's maritime development. I believe that under Xi Jinping, China has a grand strategy or a larger set of national goals that can help coordinate and inform its policy development. No nation has a perfect set of goals that are set in stone and are connected to exact policies. That evolves over time. But in as much as any nation does, I think China is relatively clear on this point. We can see some of the details from Xi Jinping's detailed speech to the 19th Party Congress. What I read from that is an ambitious plan to develop China as a great power by 2049, the centenary of the People's Republic. And as part of this, there are some significant sub-goals of becoming a top-tier military power, realizing full national reunification as Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party define it. And all of this requires significant development of China as a maritime great power, which is how it connects to the research I'm discussing with you today. Now, I think over time, China can be said to have a hierarchy of security priorities. By that I mean a list of major goals, some of which are more important than others. Since the Chinese Communist Party's coming to power in 1949, I would submit to you, it has stated that its leadership of China is essential, more important than anything else for China's national development, revitalization, and reestablishment, especially China's effort, Xi Jinping's effort to, as I put in the slide before, make China great again, to use those an echo of those four words that the US president has used. Beyond that, there is a decreasing set of priorities that radiate outward geographically from the center of Chinese political power in Beijing. I would argue that since 1949, as China under the CCP has realized some of the top priorities, it is then able to proceed down the list to the further tiers of priority, to the point where at this point China is extending major effort to further its so-called near seas island feature and maritime claims. And by the near seas, I mean the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. That's the location of all China's unresolved, still unresolved feature and maritime claims disputes. Now, there are additional layers of interest that extend outside the region across the globe. Those are not as high a priority, and I think Chinese effort and accomplishment is not yet as intense in those areas. There are different ways to overlay this geographically. I have writings in which I describe this on my website for those who might be interested further. But I think it's very interesting that whether we sketch out geographically these goals, we sketch out geographically China's various types of sovereignty claims, or we layer out the different types of military systems and their operational ranges that China has developed, we tend to see this same set of ripples of decreasing intensity that are closely connected with geography. And whatever we may argue about some of the specifics here, I do think this larger dynamic is quite significant. I think it captures some key aspects of how China's leadership sees China's national security and national maritime interests, how it has sought to further those interests, and the extent to which it has been successful in furthering those interests in a significant way. We can pick many types of military systems, including missile ranges, and again, they layer out into these diminishing ripples of capability, as you might call them. Now, Xi Jinping's stated goals for realizing the China dream and related issues tend to sound rather abstract. It is his job to lay out large concepts. It is the job of his advisors and Chinese bureaucrats down the chain of command over time to suggest how these goals might be operationalized and to implement them over time, of course, under the guidance of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. So how do some of these goals, how are they operationalized more specifically when it comes to regional security, especially military issues that are of significant priority to China? I think one of the most significant objectives for China is to develop the military capability to ideally deter or to warn the U.S. and its allies away from intervening in a sovereignty dispute of great concern to China. And barring that, to be ready in a worst case scenario to be able to intervene in a way that would frustrate the ability of the U.S. and its ally and or some of its allies and security partners to have that dispute or that issue go against the way that China would want it to go. I think that this can be described in shorthand as a counter-intervention approach. I use this because I think it's a useful term that describes what China is trying to be able to do. I know there's an academic debate of which I am part about what term is the best term to describe this sort of thing, but I offer it to you to catalyze discussion and be clear about what I think is a major motivator for some of China's military capabilities development. Now, I want to make one thing very clear here. I do not believe, even though I think that Xi Jinping is an ambitious leader, and from my perspective, I would say that he is an assertive leader in many respects. I know there's an academic debate about whether various types of Chinese behavior should be called assertive or not, but I think, to use a very colloquial term, he is large in charge, determined, and pushing forcefully to advance his interpretation of China's security interests and China's maritime interests. Be that as it may, I do not believe that he or any other major Chinese leader seeks war. I don't think the US leadership wants a war. I don't think China's leadership wants a war. So when I describe the major military capabilities that China's developing, I am not saying that China is developing them with the purpose of going to war at some point in the future. Rather, I believe that China's objective under Xi Jinping is to develop military might to achieve an image of strength and deterrence that can convince other countries that China's stated interests and objectives need to be taken seriously, and that will give China more influence in peacetime to try to further its claims. So I think that's what a lot of the very intense, sophisticated weapons development is being developed for. Of course, in a worst case scenario, like any other major military, China does consider certain uses of its military equipment. But I think that's a last resort, and that's not what China wants to do. At the same time, however, there is what you might call a low-end component or a lower prong to this military development approach. There's an effort to use the lowest level of military or armed force capability to achieve small gains over time that are not significant enough at any one time to actually risk a conflict. Here's where, as we speak, I believe, and I'll show you some evidence, China is actually involved in operational activities to further its sovereignty claims. These are often called gray zone operations by U.S. analysts. Now, like as with almost any term, good scholars can debate forever whether a term is ideal or not. I like to use the term gray zone because, at least among specialized analysts who focus on these types of issues, it's a recognized term so everyone knows what they're talking about. But I'm going to go into some specifics to further explain what I mean by Chinese maritime gray zone operations. Now, one thing we do at our China Maritime Studies Institute, and I think is a good approach overall for studying Chinese activities and understanding them, is to go to Chinese language sources. What are Chinese language sources saying? And from Chinese language sources, you can find phrases such as national defense mobilization for low-intensity maritime rights protection struggle. In China, some of China's public white papers and doctrinal publications, you can see the phrase preparation for maritime struggles. So it's fine to use these terms. I don't use them as frequently because it tends to be a very long mouthful that's confusing to a lot of people who don't study China. But the point is, there are multiple terms we can use to describe Chinese activities in the so-called maritime gray zone. But before we go further into the gray zone, which I'm focusing on today because that's where China's actually acting as we speak, I want to review for you quickly what actual Chinese maritime organizations are active in furthering China's security interests. For Xi Jinping's maritime policy in the security realm, what tools does he have as a policymaker? What can he use? And how would this, for example, compare to the tools that other countries in the region and beyond might have? So let's look briefly at China's armed forces. This setup here, I think, is one of the most important things to understand about China's armed forces and China's maritime development. There are three major armed forces. China's formal military is called the People's Liberation Army. It has a maritime subcomponent, the People's Liberation Army Navy, or just China's Navy. Most nations above a certain level of capability have navies. This is very common. A less common force that China has is a paramilitary organization called the People's Armed Police. China's Coast Guard has just been fully brought under the control of this organization. So China's Coast Guard, which was paramilitary in the past, is becoming even more of a formal military organization in command and control structure, in organizational style, and in mission focus. Finally, China has an armed force that very few other nations have in the same way. The only other nations that have something like this tend to be other communist nations, of which there are not many today. Vietnam is the closest example. China has, as its third armed force, a militia, and as its third sea force, a sea component of this militia called the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia. So these are China's three sea forces: the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the Maritime Militia. Each of these three sea forces of China is the world's largest such sea force in terms of numbers of ships. That matters. It doesn't mean that on a ship-to-ship basis, those ships are the most capable in the world. They're not, although in many cases they're improving. But numbers do matter. When you're trying to have presence in key regions, it does matter how many ships you have available to put in different places, how many ships you have available to rotate through in a cycle of training and operational activity and refitting, resupplying, refitting, repairing, all of that. So this is quite significant that China has the world's three largest sea forces in terms of numbers of ships. These are just some how China's Navy has evolved over time in terms of specific numbers, but it is the world's largest navy now in terms of numbers of ships by a small margin over the U.S. Navy, which is the second largest navy, and the U.S. Navy is the most capable navy. It's hard to know exactly how large China's Navy will be, say, by 2030, but in my research with my colleagues, we offer some potential estimates. China does have the world's largest shipbuilding industry. It's capable of building many ships of increasing sophistication. So that is powering this growth in China's fleet numbers. China also has the world's largest Coast Guard, by a very large margin, I might add. That is quite significant. China also has some of the world's largest Coast Guard vessels. Now, just having a large Coast Guard vessel doesn't mean it's the most sophisticated, but it can be very powerful and intimidating to neighbors and other countries to have a Coast Guard vessel that's larger than most Navy ships. So this is another example in which China has some very significant ships for its use. Now let's go into how China's maritime forces are actually operating at sea to try to further China's disputed maritime sovereignty claims. All three of China's sea forces are coordinating in training and operational activities at sea. In our research, we've identified many examples of this, and for those of you who are interested, you can find the details through the reports on my website. But this is one example of an exercise out in the East China Sea in which vessels from China's Navy, China's Coast Guard, and China's Maritime Militia were all training together. And as military armed forces experts can tell you, you have to train to do something to be able to actually achieve it in practice. Training is difficult. It can be very expensive. So training is a way to see what a nation is intending to be able to do. Now let's spend a few slides looking at China's maritime militia, because this is a very significant force for China, but it's not generally well understood by many non-specialists, and there aren't too many people doing research on it right now, although I'm trying to encourage more people to look at it. So what is China's maritime militia? Well, to begin with, there are two types of elite maritime militia. I'm focusing on the elite because overall the maritime militia is a large pyramid of personnel who generally have day jobs in China's marine industry, but then are registered in China's armed forces and can be called up to perform specific missions. Many of these personnel do very basic things close to shore: port security, moving supplies around, nothing that any other country would ever have cause to be worried about. It's only a very small elite at the top of the pyramid that's entrusted with going out into disputed areas and potentially getting very close to or harassing foreign vessels. So that's the elite that I focus on in my research. That's the elite that other countries would generally be concerned about. Within this elite, there are two types. Part-time, as I mentioned, and now, most recently, also a small set of very elite full-time maritime militia members who don't even have to do any kind of marine economic activity like fishing. They receive generous salaries just for going out on maritime sovereignty patrols and potentially harassing vessels from other countries. These are some more of the missions that China's elite maritime militia may be involved in. I mentioned disrupting and harassing foreign vessels. I'll show you some examples of that. Also, in a worst case scenario, or at least a bad case scenario, in some type of confrontation or conflict, China's maritime militia is supposed to be prepared to support China's Navy with logistics and other types of arrangements. For those who are interested in organizational activities, we have a detailed study that shows the command and control structure for China's maritime militia. To sum up this slide very briefly, although it's an organization that is based in local military organizations. It answers to a chain of command that goes all the way up to Xi Jinping as commander-in-chief. So this is definitely a military-controlled organization, and when any of its elite units are out and involved in international sea incidents, they are operating under this military chain of command and control. Now, this just shows the extent of elite maritime militia units in Hainan province. This is where almost all of China's elite maritime militia units, which operate in the South China Sea, are based from. There are some others that I'll show you in a minute that operate in the Paracels Islands, which would be down here if we extended the map. The other point is there is so much that can be pieced together from Chinese language open sources, which is how we do our research. We've spent almost 4 years going through hundreds of Chinese language sources, and if you look at them critically, assessing the pedigree of the source, comparing and contrasting, a painstaking data sift, you really can find out a lot. And so I like to say China's always more transparent in Chinese, or almost always so. You can't expect China to just translate everything into English. Now, I've stressed earlier in the presentation that China engages in maritime gray zone activities using its maritime law enforcement forces, or its Coast Guard, as well as its maritime militia. And I wanted to offer some specific examples over the years in which these forces, especially China's maritime militia, which I abbreviate as the PAFMM, People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, where these forces have been active in international sea incidents. So I just want to highlight a few of them. In 1974, China's maritime militia forces were on the front lines of China's successful effort to seize the Western Paracels from Vietnamese control. In 2009, maritime militia vessels were on the front lines of harassing a U.S. Navy vessel, the USNS Impeccable. In 2012, Chinese maritime militia vessels played a frontline role in supporting China's effort to wrest Scarborough Shoal from the control of the Philippines. In 2014, in China's largest maritime gray zone operation to date, maritime militia vessels, several dozen in fact, played a key role in preventing Vietnamese vessels from getting close to China's state oil rig, which it was operating in waters disputed with Vietnam, exclusive economic zone disputed with Vietnam. Finally, in an incident that is ongoing as we speak, since August 2016, Chinese maritime militia vessels have been operating in a patrol around a Philippine-claimed feature called Sandy Cay, and preventing the Philippines from getting close to or developing things on this feature. So the point is, high-end naval warfare type things are a theoretical type of preparation for worst case scenarios and peacetime deterrence. But this lower intensity maritime gray zone operation is a very real type of activity that has been happening for years and is happening as we speak. Now, most of these incidents that I showed you have occurred in the South China Sea, but there's also evidence that China is operating maritime militia vessels in the East China Sea as well. And it's been very visible with its Coast Guard vessels. So there are clearly some form of maritime gray zone operations occurring in the East China Sea as well. Zhejiang province is a location of a support base for a lot of this maritime militia development in the East China Sea. And again, we've identified through our research, my research with my colleague Connor Kennedy, more than 60 maritime militia units in Zhejiang province alone. So again, this shows what you can do with Chinese language open source research. I mentioned a new model of maritime militia development, and starting in Sansha City in the Paracels, we've seen a type of advanced full-time maritime militia commanding and crewing no fewer than 84 advanced vessels. These are not your typical South China Sea fishing boats. They are nearly 200 feet long. They have reinforced hulls suitable for ramming other vessels. They have high-powered water cannons on the masts suitable for spraying other vessels with a great degree of force. And China is recruiting with high salaries commanding officers of high caliber, including from the PLA itself. So this is a new wave in maritime militia development that I think merits further research. What this slide doesn't fully capture it, but what this Sansha Maritime Militia does in part is engage in naval-style rotational forward deployments, including from rear bases in Hainan Island proper to disputed features, Scarborough Shoal, and various features in the Spratlys. And you can see, for example, this is an extreme example, but it's still instructive. These are the Sansha Maritime Militia vessels, say, for example, patrolling around Scarborough Shoal. This is an extreme example of one of the Philippine fishing vessels. So it's pretty clear, even without China having naval vessels directly at Scarborough Shoal, with these very capable maritime militia vessels, it can make it very clear to foreign fishermen that they can't come near the feature, they can't engage in economic activities near the feature if China is determined that they should not do so. So this is a kind of Chinese sea power done in a sort of a sophisticated way that's designed to be less escalatory, but nevertheless advances China's disputed sovereignty claims in some sensitive sea areas. Now, I mentioned before another mission being to harass foreign vessels. This is an example in 2009, a U.S. surveillance ship operating in international waters was harassed by maritime militia vessels in some very unsafe behaviors that were not professional. They were not in accordance with international law. I personally think it was a mistake that the U.S. government didn't say anything publicly at the time about this, but I don't think a similar thing could happen again without a very strong U.S. government response. I think the U.S. government has become much more cognizant and has a much deeper understanding of China's maritime forces than it did, say, a decade ago. China also uses the maritime militia to escort some of its vessels in disputed areas. And here we see the Chinese oil rig I mentioned operating in disputed waters in 2014 and being surrounded by a whole cordon of Chinese vessels, Navy, Coast Guard, and maritime militia that worked in coordination to ensure that no Vietnamese vessel could approach closer than, say, 10 nautical miles to the oil rig. And there were some quite significant activities that occurred at sea. Chinese and Vietnamese vessels were spraying each other with water cannons. More powerful Chinese water cannons damaged a lot of the Vietnamese vessels, injured the crews. Several Vietnamese vessels were reportedly sunk in the process. So even though this is not a high intensity type of warfare, it's not either, it's also not necessarily a totally peaceful, benign type of activity. It's just at a lower rung on the spectrum of escalation and coercion. Another major mission for China's maritime militia is what military specialists call ISR, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, going out and monitoring things and reporting back. So in this capacity, we can find another example of China's maritime militia harassing a U.S. vessel in international waters. In this case, in 2014 in the East China Sea, another U.S. Navy vessel, the missile instrumentation ship USNS Howard O. Lorenzen, was surrounded and harassed by a reconnaissance unit from a maritime militia based in Jiangsu province. And later on, this unit was commended for its achievements by PRC Defense Minister General Chang Wanquan. So you can see that this is very clearly a type of Chinese state-sponsored activity. I think there's been some Chinese government effort to make things a little bit confusing and try to have some plausible deniability. I think as the US government says more publicly about this, it becomes impossible for China to credibly deny this. But in fairness, the U.S. can't expect other countries to do its homework for it, and so that's why I've advocated in my policy recommendations that the U.S. government say more about this publicly, and I think that is starting to happen. Now, looking towards the future, how will China's maritime militia continue to advance and become more sophisticated? Well, from Chinese sources, we can see some activities involving the use of unmanned underwater vehicles. This is a very interesting development because that's one of those technologies that's a new trend in maritime military development. Perhaps unmanned aerial vehicles could be used by China's maritime militia in the future. These will be interesting things for specialized researchers to watch. I know there's a lot more to China's maritime development and military maritime development than these sovereignty promotion activities in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and the Yellow Sea. So I'll just very briefly close with a few slides about China's maritime security activities further from home. In recent years, China's naval strategy has evolved from what was called near seas active defense, so a focus on what I talked about in the 3 near seas, to a combination of near seas active defense and far seas operations. This is an outer layer of lower intensity efforts to improve China's influence, presence and influence out into the Indian Ocean and beyond, to be able to do things to safeguard its citizens. For example, anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, evacuation of vulnerable citizens from Libya and Yemen, Yemen. These are things that China can already do quite capably. No other country, or certainly no other large country, is going to oppose China in doing those things. So it's not the same as being able to do very high intensity things closer to home. But these are some of the other areas of Chinese maritime effort. Over time, China's growing interests in energy imports and sea lane security may continue to drive the development of its naval capabilities. I think that's quite possible, but we'll have to see exactly where that goes. It's very expensive and difficult to develop truly high-level naval capabilities far from home, such as the U.S. has around the world today. So I think it's very much a question to what extent China will develop that. Already China has some such capabilities. It will continue to develop more such capabilities, but how far will China go by when? I don't think Xi Jinping himself can know, because it's dependent on a lot of different factors that go back to China's hierarchy of national security priorities. One of Xi Jinping's signature aspects of operationalizing his grand strategy to make China great again is what used to be called the One Belt, One Road Initiative, and has already been named the Belt and Road Initiative, I guess to sound a little bit less forward-leaning and perhaps intimidating or threatening to other countries. There is a major sea component to this, to bring other countries closer to China, to bring them together in a network of commerce and Chinese strategic influence. This could be very beneficial for China geostrategically. It could also be very expensive and challenging. So we'll have to see how that plays out over time. There's a lot of enthusiasm for aircraft carrier development. These images may seem confusing to many, but what these people are doing is showing enthusiasm for China finally having its own aircraft carrier, and including someone on the deck who's called the shooter, clearing an aircraft for launch off the deck of the aircraft carrier. So these Chinese citizens are showing their excitement that their nation finally has such a thing, in a way that American citizens might have been excited about decades ago. But nowadays, not so many Americans perhaps pay attention to sea power because we take it for granted that we've had it. So there is a lot of nationalism and nationalist excitement that may drive some of these big naval capabilities, but I would argue only to a certain extent. I don't think nationalism just explains everything. But again, we'll have to see. Finally, as I wrap things up, I want to suggest to you that there may be a constraining factor on the rapidity of Chinese naval and maritime development in the future. Different people have called it different things, but I call it China's S-curved trajectory, or China's S-curved slowdown. There's a pattern common to great powers, successful great powers, in which there's a period of national consolidation and development that allows for very rapid growth across all areas of national power. Ultimately, however, through that growth, the economy develops, citizens aspire to the finer things in life, they aspire to a more comfortable and better life. Their priorities change. The rate of population growth slows as people have smaller families. As the rate of economic growth slows, the budget available for military development faces more constraints. As more of a welfare state develops to help take care of the vulnerable and to help support older people who are no longer in the workforce, there are competing budget priorities that make it harder to just allocate huge amounts of money to military mega projects the way the U.S. was able to do, say, in the 1950s and 60s, or the way that China has been able to do up to right about now. So I believe that in coming years, China is going to face tougher choices in terms of its national priorities and spending. And this is going to impact how much can be spent on naval development. So China's already arrived as a great power and as a great power at sea, but I don't think the rates of economic, naval, and other great power development can be sustained. I think there will be a slowing over time, but we will have to see what actually happens in practice. So I thank you all very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and our discussion. If you have further interest in my research, please feel free to go to my research websites here. And finally, for those who might be curious, this is me in 2014 with the then head of China's Navy, Admiral Wu Shangli, when I was helping to give him a tour of Harvard University when he was seeking some ideas to further Chinese naval educational reform. So thank you very much and look forward to it. Thank you.